Hello, and welcome to Fishin' Tales. Fishin' Tales is a collection of stories about the adventures and misadventures of the outdoor sportsman. I hope that these tales make you smile, tug at your heart, or maybe just bring back a memory or two. So sit back and take a listen, and remember my motto: never let the truth stand in the way of a good story. Does yours taste funny? Young men celebrate their high school graduation in many different ways. And I'd like to tell you about one very unique experience that was had by 4 graduates. Terry, Bob, Nick, and Eddie had finally escaped from high school, and they were ready for the whole world. The boys had planned their graduation trip for months. Well, it wasn't exactly a trip. It was more of an outing. You see, they were sportsmen, and their celebration was going to be a combination camping and fishing trip to a secluded spot on the Llano River. Bob's uncle owned the land, so they were assured of the total privacy that they wanted. By Saturday afternoon, following Friday night's graduation, these 4 sportsmen were looking over their camp location. It was perfect. The river was clear and flowing, with some real fishy-looking holes just down the stream. The bank was flat and shaded by big trees, and just upstream from the camp, the river turned to the west and out of sight. The boys quickly put the camp together, and it was the best camp they'd ever seen: 2 sleeping tents, a fire pit, and all the stuff needed to make this trip unforgettable. With the work done, they knew what was next: fishing for dinner. They sat around the camp and rigged their rods for some of those Llano River bass. A lot of bragging about the past and speculation about the future had the boys' spirits high as they began their fishing. As I mentioned earlier, the stretch of water just downstream looked perfect, so that's where they headed. Sure enough, the fish were there, and they were biting. Within an hour or so, each fisherman had enough for his dinner, with fish left over. All the fish were cleaned, and about a dozen were earmarked for a campfire fish fry. Water from the river to boil some potatoes and corn from Terry's mom's garden, and the feast was on. After an hour or so of eating, the boys laid back on their bedrolls and told half-truths and outright lies till they turned in for the night. The next morning, more water from the river was brought up for their coffee. Eating was one of the things these boys did best, and they proved it again with a breakfast of eggs, bacon, campfire biscuits, and river water coffee. With the eating all done, more fishing was next. The boys decided to head upstream for new adventure. As they made the turn in the river, the adventure and the fishing stopped. You see, they learned 2 real important lessons as they rounded that turn in the river. First, always fish upstream before you set your camp, and second, never use the rotting carcass of a dead cow to filter your water. Well, the sight of this long-departed heifer sent all 4 boys to the bank, where in unison they lost their breakfast and their dinners. This ugly turn of events left them too weak to fish, so they broke camp and headed for home. As it will in a small town, their stories spread as fast as last winter's flu bug. Most of their families and friends thought the boy's sickness was probably just mental. But Nick's little brother had a different idea. He said Nick was too stupid to be mentally ill. Move over, please. Anton was on his way to meet his old friend Leo, and together they were set to do some serious fishing. Old Anton was running late as usual, and by the time he reached Leo's house, Leo was some kind of mad. "Pass that excuse by me, Anton. You always got a good one," Leo said. And sure enough, Anton had an unusually good excuse. He said that in order to make better time, he had tried to cut across some back roads along the Louisiana coast. He topped a levee only to be confronted with a very narrow bridge that presented a very unique problem. Stretched across that narrow, wet bridge was a speed bump with teeth. A very healthy 10-foot South Louisiana swamp gator that was in no hurry to move. In fact, it didn't budge at Anton's threats or the loud blast from his truck's horn. This was a most certain showdown between Anton and the gator. Just when it appeared that the gator had won and Anton was preparing to turn his truck around, he noticed a really beat-up old truck coming toward the bridge from the other direction. So Anton decided to wait. The old truck coughed and slid to a stop just a few feet from that unbothered gator. And an old Cajun fella got out of the truck and started for the gator. He was raising Cain, Cajun style. Now, Anton couldn't understand everything that was said, but he did recognize a few selected phrases. The old man walked right up to the gator and gave it one heck of a kick right in the side of its belly. The gator slowly turned its head and with a sudden jerk snapped at the old man, not missing his leg by more than a few inches. Well, now the old man was really mad, and he went back to his truck and picked up what appeared to be about a 4-foot axe handle. Back to the gator he went. He commenced to give that old reptile about 4 or 5 hard whacks round the head and snout. Anton couldn't believe what he was seeing. Sure enough, that 10-foot alligator vacated the road. The old Cajun, mumbling all the while, got back in his truck and drove by Anton in a big hurry. Leo just looked at Anton and said, "So that's your excuse?" "Absolutely, replied Anton. Not another word was mentioned by Leo or Anton for the entire day's fishing. About 2 weeks later, Leo happened to see Anton at a crawfish boil down on the bayou. After a few minutes of visiting, Anton said to Leo, "You know that old gator that was on that bridge?" "Yeah, I remember," replied Leo. "Well, I saw that very same gator down in New Orleans last week on Canal Street. I didn't hardly recognize him. He was in this department store window disguised as 2 pieces of luggage, a briefcase, a purse, and a pair of fine women's shoes." Now, Leo knew that Anton was a liar, but he just couldn't tell when he was starting or stopping. A matter of principle. This summer morning was just like countless other hill country mornings. Just cool enough to hide the reality of the boring afternoon that was sure to come. As I stepped off the bank and into the cool, shallow water of Hondo Creek, I knew it was just where I wanted to be. Before me lay 2 hours of what I consider to be one of the world's few surviving pleasures. These 2 hours would be quiet, without disruption, yet filled with the silent energy of the flowing creek. For this brief period, I planned to be consumed by a total devotion directed at fooling every bass and every perch and every shadowy hideaway along this whole stretch of Hondo Creek. My tools for this mission included an 8-foot light-action fly rod and reel, along with a box of dry flies certain to do the trick. Now, I'm strictly a catch-and-release fisherman unless one of those Medina County monsters is so deeply hooked that his demise is inevitable. In that case, my tools are expanded to include a snap-type stringer, cornmeal, cooking oil, and a cast-iron skillet. The first hour was, as I expected, filled with long, feather-like casts that had secured a number of battles between me and a selection of bass and perch. I've fished this section of Hondo Creek so many times that I believe I actually recognize some of the fish that have fallen victim to my skills. After one hard-fought battle, I discovered that a healthy 6-inch bluegill perch had inhaled my favorite grasshopper fly. The fly could not be removed without fatal damage to the perch. After a moment of remorse, the perch was attached to the end of my stringer and placed in the water behind me. I continued to fish the bluegill, having no choice in the matter since they followed my every move. It wasn't long before I felt a tug on my stringer. Thinking that it was caught on a rock, I turned to secure its release. But the rock was not a rock at all. You see, the tail of my perch was locked in the jaws of a determined turtle about half the size of a football. Thankfully, the demise of the perch had already taken place when the turtle had decided that possibly the ownership of this bluegill was up for grabs. Well, I felt bad about the death of the perch, but I was looking forward to the transformation of that perch into a crispy golden brown Maine course, so I decided to show that turtle just who that perch belonged to. I pulled the stringer quickly through the water, but nothing happened. I gave several sharp jerks on the stringer, but still no sign of a release. I jabbed at the turtle with a stick, but there was no hint of surrender. I threw rocks at this creature I was starting to hate, but it did me no good, probably because I was never able to actually hit it with a rock. Finally, I had an idea that was sure to work. I'd drag that turtle onto the bank, and it would figure out that it was on my turf now. The turtle would release the perch and scurry back into the creek. So I pulled the turtle onto the bank through the grass and over the rocks for a good 10 feet, but no release. As I waited, the turtle's resolve seemed to grow even stronger. I struck at the determined creature with a bigger stick, and its grip only tightened. I finally decided to concede defeat and release the perch from the stringer. The turtle backed away with the perch still in its jaws. Then, suddenly, or as suddenly as a turtle does anything, the turtle released the perch, turned, and slowly made its way to the creek without the perch. It was then that I realized that all along it was I who wanted the perch. To the turtle, it had been just a matter of principle. Jail ain't that bad. Game Warden Daniels knew that R.C. and Judy Johnson were prone to taking a few fish over the limit. The warden had ticketed the couple on more than one occasion and had even taken old R.C. to jail a time or two. But this July evening was going to be a lot different from any of those previous encounters. From a hill that overlooked a small boat dock, Warden Daniels kept his binoculars on R.C. and Judy as they loaded 3 ice chests into the rear bed of their old green pickup. With their flat-bottom riverboat secured to the dock, R.C. and Judy hopped into the pickup truck and headed for town. Warden Daniels knew where to wait, and sure enough, after about a 2-minute wait at the corner of County Road 11 and Rural Route 117, R.C. and Judy drove right by Warden Daniels. The engine on his official state vehicle hissed and coughed badly as he pulled in behind R.C. and Judy. Judy was the first to spot Warden Daniels, and boy, did she begin to give it to old R.C. The misery he was receiving from his beloved bride, Judy, was really something to see. Warden Daniels thought that this verbal abuse, and at times near physical abuse R.C. was enduring, would be a just addition to R.C.'s soon-to-be-experienced legal consequences. So Warden Daniels decided to follow this unhappy couple for a little while longer. Now, as the ride continued, Judy got louder and taller in her seat. R.C. got quieter and lower behind the wheel of that old truck. As they neared the edge of town, it looked like old R.C. was about to succumb, so the warden decided it was time to step in. He pulled up behind him at a red light, and as he reached to turn on his red and blue flashing light, his official state vehicle died. And I mean died. No engine, no lights, no siren, no nothing. As R.C. and Judy pulled across the intersection, the game warden quickly opened his doors, stepped out, and waved his arm. Well, as soon as the warden's feet hit the pavement, the brake lights, well, actually just one brake light on the back of R.C.'s old truck popped on, and before his truck stopped rolling, R.C. was out the door and walking toward Warden Daniels. Warden Daniels escorted him back to the truck and thanked him for stopping. He explained how his official state vehicle was completely dead, and if R.C. had just driven off, then he would not have been able to check the ice chest in the rear of the truck. Well, upon hearing this, Judy lit into R.C. worse than ever. It seemed that she had disagreed with R.C.'s decision to surrender, and when she heard that freedom could have been theirs by simply driving off, well, it was just too much for her to bear. Well, sure enough, the contents of those ice chests revealed several game and fish violations, and it was off to see the judge for R.C. and Judy. Because of past appearances, the judge really lowered the boom on this fish-hungry couple, so much so that their combined resources were well short of those needed to avoid a night in a local jail. This apparently was Judy's first experience with incarceration, and it was very clear who she blamed for her run of bad luck. Once outside the courtroom, her verbal attack and deep-felt promises that she was making to R.C. were enjoyed by everyone in the area except R.C. Finally separated there at the jail, R.C. seemed relieved to the point of joy at being placed in his cell far from Judy. The next morning, the jailer opened the door that separated the sheriff's office from the jail area and started toward R.C.'s cell. Beyond that door, R.C. heard the now familiar rants and raves of Judy as, again, she spoke of her feelings toward R.C. and just what the future held for him. As the jailer opened R.C.'s cell door, R.C. spoke. "You know, a couple more days in here might do a lot toward my rehabilitation." Dad knows everything. You know, most big problems start out as just little bitty mistakes. Take, for example, Joe Daniels' new bay fishing boat. It was 1958, and I was 10 years old, and Joe Daniels was our next-door neighbor. For years, Mr. Daniels had an old gray boat that he would take to the bay every weekend for some serious fishing. He maintained his boat in good condition, but it was still real old and out of style. Then it happened. Mr. Daniels brought home a brand new wooden boat made by the Helton Boat Works. This new boat was a beauty, and Mr. Daniels spent every evening and every weekend just getting ready to go fishing. He added all kinds of great stuff to the boat, and I watched his every move. He polished the chrome and the wood till they looked like the shine on my sister's piano. He worked on every part of that boat, and he was finally ready to take her out. On Friday evening, he began to load up his fishing equipment for his before-daylight Saturday morning departure. I sat in the grass beside the boat as Mr. Daniels told me all about the boat for the fourth or fifth time, but I didn't mind because I also thought it was about the greatest bay boat around. When I awoke on that Saturday morning, sure enough, Mr. Daniels and his boat were gone. As I ate my cereal in front of the TV, from time to time I'd think about Mr. Daniels out there fishing, and it made me feel good. After a full day of playing down by the ditch, I was in my room when I heard Mr. Daniels turn his truck in his driveway. But by the time I got to his garage, the boat was there, but Mr. Daniels was already in his house. I jumped off the tail of the trailer to look into the boat to try to see any signs of how the fishing had been. But inside of the back half of the boat just didn't look right. It looked like it had been all wet. And there was sand on the floor and in the back seats. Something was wrong. About that time, my dad drove up, and Mr. Daniels came out of his house. My dad asked how the fishing had been, and Mr. Daniels said he didn't get to go, and that he almost lost his new boat. Dad asked what happened, and Mr. Daniels told a very strange story. It seems that when he left the dock mooring, his boat started to fill up with water. My dad asked if he had put the plugs in, and he responded that of course he had the plugs in. Back in those days, a boat had 3 plugs, one in each of the live wells near the back of the boat, plus a third plug in the rear transom. When all of those plugs were removed and the boat was run at a fast speed, any water in the boat would run out, or so Mr. Daniels thought. So when he noticed water in his boat, he opened the 3 plugs and ran his boat at top speed. But what happened was just the opposite of what was supposed to. The faster Mr. Daniels would run his boat, the more the water would rise. He barely made it back to the docks, and he quickly removed the boat from the water. Confused and frustrated, he decided to drive his new boat home to see if he could possibly figure out what went wrong. My dad had listened closely to Mr. Daniels' story, and without a second's hesitation, he told Mr. Daniels his problem. You see, on the bottom of the boat where the holes from the live wells empty out, there's a small cup-shaped piece attached to the boat so that as the boat runs at a high speed, the water from the live wells can easily run out. Mr. Daniels' problem was that whoever had put those cup-shaped pieces on his boat had put them on backwards. So the faster Mr. Daniels would go, the cups would actually catch the water and force it up into the boat. Hearing my dad's explanation, Mr. Daniels mumbled something of an unbelieving nature as he slid under his boat to check it out and make sure my dad was wrong. What he found were 2 chrome cup-shaped attachments, both pointed in the wrong direction. Mr. Daniels came out from under that boat praising my dad's ability to figure that out so quickly and with such confidence. My dad said there was nothing to it, and he was glad to help. Later that night, I asked my dad how he thought about those cups so fast. He said it was easy. He had seen a new Helton boat at his job that morning that had the very same problem. Now that's the end of side 1, so you can fast forward or just sit tight. I'll be right back. For all you fishermen out there listening, here's a chance for you to be a part of my fishing tales. If you know a good fishing story or just some outdoor occurrence that's a little or a lot on the unusual side, please get in touch with me at the phone number or address in the case of these tapes. If I use any part of your story, I'll send you a special gift that I know you'll enjoy. double dose. This may be the only one of my outdoor stories to ever be verified by several sportsmen, none of whom were involved in any 12-step program. There are two key elements of the story that set the stage for some predictable misadventures. The first element is that the entire story takes place in Mexico, and the second element is that it involves a group of Texas sportsmen from Dallas. Now, the general consensus of the hunting and fishing boys down around Beaumont, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, and the Valley is that bunch from Dallas is definitely prone to some serious mistakes. This all said, let's get back to the story. The location for the story is Lake Cuero Lodge, and the Dallasite was an outdoor rookie, John Kidd. This group consisted of 30 Dallas businessmen, so there would definitely be a large audience to review the success and failures of this 3-day adventure, and I do mean adventure. The trip was to include both white-winged dove hunting and largemouth bass fishing, and John Kidd was well prepared for both. He'd brought along 3 12-gauge shotguns, a pump, an automatic, and a very fancy over and under model. He also had all the latest spin cast and bait casting rods and reels, as well as everything that could fit into a tackle box that looked about the size of one of those foot lockers you kids take to camp. Old John Kidd was ready. The first activity was to be an afternoon white-winged dove hunt that would include some prize pigeon shooting. John was dropped off at a brush line that overlooked a huge field that was as far as the eye could see. He was left with 2 cases of shells and 2 bird boys. Now, John spoke not a word of Spanish, which is common in Dallas, and characteristically his 2 bird boys spoke limited English. Within an hour, the action was unbelievable. Birds were coming from every direction, and John was actually firing a shotgun from each hand. The bird boys yelled helpful instructions to John, but the only word he understood was, "Pigeon, pigeon, pigeon," they would yell. It seemed the bird boys preferred to eat the pigeons, so they kept them in separate piles next to themselves, so the doves were scattered around John. Well, all this was going great when something happened that was definitely not on the activity schedule. Across the field came a speeding Jeep with a driver and another man standing up. As they drew closer to John, the bird boys shouted, "Federales, federales," and they disappeared into the brush line. As the Jeep came closer, John could hear the men shouting, and he could see that the man standing was holding a mounted .60 caliber machine gun that John recognized from the movie The Dirty Dozen. John now sensed trouble, and he stood perfectly still with a shotgun in each hand. As the Jeep slid to a stop, the man standing let go a burst of machine gun fire over John's head. Well, it was the loudest and most frightening moment of John's life. He dropped his shotguns as every one of his past real estate transactions flashed across his mind. The men jumped from the Jeep, still yelling at John. They wore uniforms, although their look was kind of a combination of a UPS man and a security guard at the mall. They gathered up all of John's belongings, all 3 guns, all the shotgun shells, the doves, a cooler, a chair, and put them in the Jeep, and they were gone. As the Jeep went out of sight, the bird boys reappeared as if nothing had happened. Now there was nothing to do except walk toward the shotgun sounds of the other hunters. There were 2 clear and distinct reactions to John's adventure. The hunt manager was very upset. After he assured John that all of his belongings would be returned, he left the lodge and headed for the offices of the head federale. The other reaction came from, of course, John's companions, many of whom risked internal injury from the depth and length of their laughter. Every time John would appear, they would all throw their arms in the air and beg for mercy. Lucky for John, everyone had to turn in early because the bass fishing started well before daylight the next day. The next morning brought more apologies from the lodge manager, and to help make up for John's problem, he was going to be assigned the best of the fishing guides. The guide, Raul, was a very small man who could not have weighed more than 120 pounds maximum. Now, that fact may not seem interesting, but it has a definite bearing on the story, because John's weight fluctuated somewhere between 350 pounds and really heavy. The fishing vessels at Lake Cuero Lodge were 10 or 12 foot, flat-bottom boats with average power motors. Now, the difference between John at 350 pounds and Raul at 120 minus pounds caused the front end of the boat to ride very low in the water. The severity of this configuration was hidden by darkness as John and Raul pulled away from the dock. The black water of the lake slid beneath the boat, and John was once again longing to be able to enjoy his adventure. His anticipation of enjoyment was a bit premature, however. The next few minutes of John's life would rank him high on the list of Dallas sportsmen caught in a true outdoor dilemma. Do you remember back when I told you about how low the front end of the boat was compared to the rear end of the boat? As the boat entered an old area of the lake, the front of the boat was obviously too low in the water, and a submerged tree put a 10-foot-long gash in the bottom of the boat. Within seconds, the boat, the motor, and everything in the boat started settling to the bottom of the lake. Now, this left John and Raul floating on the lake's surface without a clear plan. Well, from that moment forward, Raul never spoke another word of English. Raul went one way, and John went the other. As they floated in total darkness, John recalled the many photos at the lodge of alligators and water moccasins, neither of which he had encountered at the lake on the fourth hole of the Dallas Country Club. The only things that were visible to John were the shadowy outlines of old trees as they rose from the lake. His plan was to swim to a selected tree, climb the tree, and calmly wait for help. Well, this plan began to literally fall apart as the first 4 trees selected by John cracked and crumbled under his 350-plus pounds. Finally, John was able to find a tree that was sturdy enough to hold him. So he slung his right leg through a fork in the tree and held on. Through the darkness, he could hear the ranting and raving of Raul. John quickly figured out that Raul's discomfort probably had a lot to do with the fact that Raul's job opportunities at Lake Cuero Lodge had most likely sunk with the boat. As the morning wore on, the cramp in John's right leg was so bad that he swore he'd never eat Mexican food again if he could just get out of that tree. This promise, in light of John's love of food, certainly defined the severity of his pain. It was not until about noon that John and Raul were rescued. They were picked up by another fisherman and his guide and returned to the lodge. Well, this event was just too much for the lodge manager. He was so upset and embarrassed that he spent the next day and a half avoiding John. But the attitude that prevailed among John's friends now only intensified. When John would come into view, they'd throw up their arms and run to hug the closest tree. Well, years have passed since that trip, but the memories are still clear in John's mind, let alone the recurring cramps in his right leg, and that constant ringing in his ears caused by machine gun blasts. And after all this, John still writes it off to just bad luck. But I'll tell you something. I still think it has something to do with being from Dallas. Overboard. Pete Johnson is a devoted fisherman who spends every possible minute on the lakes and rivers of his home area. He'll fish for any kind of fish at any time and anywhere. There's one unusual aspect to Pete's constant relationship to the water. He can't swim, and he won't even try to learn. Pete says that water's for fishing and taking a shower, and that's it. So whenever Pete goes fishing, he stays in the boat or on the shore, and that's final. Well, in the late summer of 1998, all that changed. Pete and one of his best fishing pals, Ed Simmons, were fishing a small lake just south of town. This lake was filled with stumps, and sure enough, Pete and Ed found one of those stumps that was hidden just under the surface of the lake. Now, this collision occurred just as Pete was leaning over the edge of the boat to release a bass. Well, impact met opportunity, and old Pete was heading for the lake. Pete didn't score too high on his first dive, but he did set a record for the quickest time required to grab the side of the boat. As he grabbed the boat, Pete brought his knees up right under his chin. So there's Pete, bobbing like a ball in the water with a death grip on that boat. Now, when you're rolled up in a ball like old Pete was, it's impossible to climb back into the boat. As Ed looked on, he began to laugh, but old Pete paid him no attention. Ed's laugh grew louder and louder, and Pete got madder and madder. When Ed just couldn't laugh anymore, he said to Pete, "Well, I guess I better give you a hand." With that, Ed jumped over the side of the boat and stood beside Pete, and his laughter began again. You see, the water was only waist deep. Pete stopped bobbing and stood up next to Ed, and as he climbed back into the boat, Pete said with a new confidence, "You know, learning to swim's not that hard." Catch and what? The fight was over, and the trophy bass lay dripping in the net beside the boat. Both of us were gasping from the battle. I looked downward at my catch, and she seemed to roll her glistening wet eyes at me. Then, carefully holding her just so, I removed the lure from the lip of her mouth. Her tail flopped, but her gills worked slowly. I touched her dorsal fin as I submerged her into the water. After a brief moment, she twisted her body and moved into the deep shadows of the lake. Farewell, great fighting friend, farewell, and good luck. You know, for years I've been reading and hearing descriptions like this from the great-hearted giants among fishermen, and each time I get a powerful lump in my throat. In fact, these men of such fishing prowess and stature fill me with awe, and I feel a great inferiority being in their presence. I envy beyond comparison these gallant men who are forever releasing the big ones and watching them swim away and wishing them luck. Yes, I envy these fishermen with their greatness of heart and their nobility of spirit, but I cannot copy them. I regret on those occasions that I seem to possess the heart of a buzzard and the spirit of an IRS agent. My weak and fallen character always fails to respond unto the lofty challenge of the situation. I guess I simply lack the depth of spirit and the extravagance of soul. My really big fish are few and far between, and I keep 'em. Furthermore, I wail like a lost soul whenever I lose one. I've long rationalized my position with the knowledge that all bass are cannibals and that the big ones are the worst offenders, so that by removing them from the lake, I'm really doing both the other fish and the other fishermen a good turn. But try as I might to rationalize myself into feelings of satisfaction, in my secret heart, I know that I can never truly, really belong. I'm a greedy bass fisherman who doesn't release the big one. I do, however, release a lot of small legal bass, and many's the time that I'll leave the lake with less than the limit. I know that this simple attempt on my part will never qualify me for membership in the exclusive fraternity of the true catch-and-release champions, but I try to console myself. I want to belong, and soon I hope to enter the Catch and Cornmeal program in hopes that its 12-step program can bring me out of my selfish ways. Come out with your hands up. One of the slimiest cases of hidden evidence comes from the case of a lady poacher who filled her underwear with illegal fish in an attempt to trick the local game warden. But he wasn't easily fooled, and soon he got to the bottom of her deception. The game warden was using one of his routine methods to check for fishing violations. He was stationed at a marina and would check the boats as they came in. Everything seemed normal as the morning wore on, until a couple pulled up and seemed a bit nervous for the situation. The warden checked their licenses, their fish, and the boat. No problem. But then something unusual happened as the woman stood rigid near the boat. Her backside began to wiggle in several directions at once. The warden asked the woman to walk toward him, and as she did, a fish slipped from under her shorts and fell to the ground. With each step, a new fish appeared, 9 in all. The warden wasn't sure all the fish were out, so he asked the lady to lean over, and sure enough, there was a clear imprint of a 10th fish on her rear end. The warden decided that the fish would become part of the punishment phase of this case, so he left it in her pants. Stiff fines were received, then the couple went on their way. I think the lady just wanted to put the whole thing behind her. Fishin' Shorts. Fishing stories that you can enjoy don't have to be long, drawn-out tales. They can be short and still get the point across. Here's a few examples. The most useless piece of equipment you can take fishing is a watch. After years of fishing, most fishermen have come to the conclusion that to be a real expert at fishing, you have to know the percentages. 1%'s the condition of the water. 1%'s the atmospheric condition. 1%'s having the proper attachment. 1%'s knowledge of the fish patterns. 1%'s proper presentation to the fish. And 95%'s whether the fish are biting or not. If a man's seeking happiness for just a couple of hours, he should have a few beers. If he wants to be happy for 3 days, he just barbecues a pig and eats it. If he wants to be happy for a week, he should get hitched. But if he wants to be happy forever, he should learn to fish. A wise old fisherman relayed the following bit of wisdom. You don't have to journey 1,000 miles or even go 50 miles for a fishing adventure. The fish are probably not biting just as well near your house. What's the one thing you can count on when 4 fishermen get together? There'll always be a 5th nearby. There's one fishing question that's never been answered. Are all fishermen big liars, or do only big liars fish? I'll end with a short poem by St. Clair Adams. It goes like this. Old Noah went a-fishing. He set upon the ark. He kept his hooks a-dangle from daylight into dark. His catch was pretty meager, but everyone affirms he never had a chance. You see, he only had 2 small worms. Matching the hatch. You know, being a fisherman for almost 40 years has left me totally unprepared to understand the latest and fastest growing of all the angling activities. This phenomenon is fly fishing. On a recent summer vacation to Colorado, a large sign on the edge of a small town caught my eye. The sign read, Spring Valley Fly Fishing Lodge. And I thought to myself, well, now here's an opportunity to broaden my horizons. So down the road I went to the Spring Valley Fly Fishing Lodge. As the road dropped to the valley below and the lodge came into view, the first comparison to my present realm of experience was clear. This lodge did not resemble any bait camp or fishing marina that I had ever seen. It was built of cut stone and logs. It was 3 stories high and as long as a fishing pier. The next difference was certainly a new fishing experience for me, valet parking. Where I fish, if you give somebody your key, he had better be your fishing buddy. Well, upon entering the lodge, you're confronted with a new item, the lodge directory. I mean, just how many bait camp directories have you seen? The directory included the following items: breakfast dining area, lunch dining area, evening dining area, the photography shop, the coffee shop, the men's shop, the women's shop, video room, cigar room, meeting room, front desk, airline information, horseback riding, tennis, swimming pool, hiking, health spa, and lastly, fishing supplies and information. I followed the fishing supplies arrow, and as I reached the corridors for this area, I pondered the feasibility of an upscale gift shop at Sparky's Bait Barn and Marina down home. Now, I finally reached the fishing area. Suddenly, I felt underdressed. I was the only person there in cutoffs, flip-flops, and an Astroworld t-shirt. The uniform of the day was apparently anything with a trout on it. One fella had on a trout hat, one a trout shirt, and one had on trout pants. I felt relieved when on first inspection the 4th person in the fishing area was apparently troutless. Then I saw him, trout socks. I felt so alone. I then asked one of the workers about a very small basket called a creel that was for sale for $79.95, and he informed me that the creel was used to hold the fish you caught. The creels were for sale directly under a large permanent sign clearly stating that the Spring Valley Fly Fishing Lodge was strictly a catch-and-release fishing area and that no fish were to be kept. So let me sum up what I learned about the creel. The creel was a $5 basket you could buy for $80 so you'd have a place to put all the fish you're not allowed to keep. Maybe I missed something. I next entered the fly area. This area was filled with roughly 6 million different fly designs. I was becoming dazed and disoriented as I tried to study those tiny pieces of threads and feathers, and then I saw something I recognized. A grasshopper, perfectly constructed with a tiny gold hook coming through its belly. The price was $6.50 per grasshopper. When I told the clerk you could catch a grasshopper right outside and run a 10-cent hook through it, I thought he was going to call security. Well, I quickly moved away from the fly area to avoid another confrontation. One more thing caught my eye as I was leaving the fishing area. On a large wooden rack, they were selling monofilament leaders with no swivels, no snaps. A 7-foot leader was $5. Now, I'd hate to tell those old boys, but if you wait until the spring fishing sale at the sporting goods store, that monofilament line is a penny a yard. But then again, there's no valet parking. Well, I felt like I learned enough about fly fishing for the first lesson, but I was getting a little hungry. So I decided to follow the arrows to the lunch dining area. And what do you know? The menu included broiled trout, poached trout, and pan-fried trout. Now, I didn't know who was running the lunch area, but it was pretty clear to me that he hadn't been down to the fishing area to read the catch and release sign. Well, that's about it for now. Hope you enjoyed them, and I look forward to sharing some more of my tales with you again real soon. Just remember, it's much better to listen to them than it is to be a part of them. Hello, and welcome to Fishin' Tales. Fishin' Tales is a collection of stories about the adventures and misadventures of the outdoor sportsman. I hope that these tales make you smile, tug at your heart, or maybe just bring back a memory or two. So sit back and take a listen, and remember my motto: never let the truth stand in the way of a good story. Terms of endearment. You know, a real problem has developed because of the growing popularity of fly fishing. Since there are actually very few new words being introduced, many words have to take on a new meaning. Therein lies the problem. What one word means to the fly fisherman may have a totally different meaning to the fly fisherman's wife. I've selected a few terms used by the average fly fisherman and will give you the contrast in meaning between what he thinks and what his wife thinks. Here's what I mean. Attractor. To the fly fisherman, it's the bright color in a fly used to attract attention. To his wife, it's a new hairdo. You get the idea? Bank. The area above an eroding shoreline. To the fly fisherman's wife, it's a place where you want to be very well known. Barb. A raised point behind the point of a hook to hold the fish securely on the hook. To the fly fisherman's wife, a gal in the neighborhood who's just a little too good looking. Bass. To the fly fisherman, it's a group of freshwater fish that includes largemouth bass, spotted bass, and smallmouth bass. To the fly fisherman's wife, it's a casual shoe line. Belly. To the fly fisherman, a large midsection of a fly line. To the fly fisherman's wife, it's something Barb doesn't have. A bug. To the fly fisherman, it's a floating bass fly that imitates certain larger insects. To the fly fisherman's wife, it's something she's thinking about having installed in her husband's office. Catch and release. The term used for releasing fish unharmed. To the fly fisherman's wife, the dating advice she gives her teenage daughter. Channel. To the fly fisherman, it's the main structural depression that has been caused by flowing water. To his wife, it's the name of a fine perfume that's been misspelled. Current. To the fly fisherman, the flowing or pulling of the water in a stream. To his wife, one of the words she uses to describe her husband. Eddy. To the fly fisherman, the calm, slowly swirling water found behind a rock or the obstruction in a flowing stream. To his wife, a good-looking young man who works at the gas station. Extension butt. To the fly fisherman, an extension placed on the butt of the rod for leverage in fighting larger fish. To his wife, it's something to avoid at all costs. Fish scent. To a fly fisherman, an odor placed on artificial lures used to attract fish. To his wife, how to know when your special fly fisherman is home. Gap. To the fly fisherman, the distance between the hook shank and the point. To his wife, a store in the mall where it's fun to hang out. Gill. To the fly fisherman, it's the respiratory organ of a water-breathing fish. To the fly fisherman's wife, it's a good-looking young man who works at the Gap. Loop. To the fly fisherman, the U-shape of the fly line as it unrolls forward or backward during the casting cycle. To his wife, The road you take to the mall to get to the gap to see if Gil's working. Outlet. To the fly fisherman, it's part of the lake where the water flows out. To his wife, it's where to shop for discounted clothing if Gil's not working. Putting down. To the fly fisherman, it's when fish have been scared and have stopped feeding. To his wife, putting down, as in people like Barb, is a hobby, just like fly fishing. Reel. To the fly fisherman, the device used to retrieve the fly line and leader. To his wife, a concept Barb knows nothing about. Waders. To the fly fisherman, it's waterproof shoes and pants used for wading. To the fly fisherman's wife, a group of young, good-looking men who bring you cocktails at the country club. Wiggle nymph. To the fly fisherman, a two-section hinged-bodied artificial nymph fly. To his wife, the young girl who works at the Gap who's after Gil and Eddie. Looking forward to looking back. 3 young fishermen sat on the end of the pier at the marina and readied themselves for a full morning of fishing. Their rods and reels and all their tackle were hand-me-downs from older brothers, uncles, and in some cases their dads. But it didn't matter a bit to this group of 10 and 11-year-olds. They were dedicated to the task at hand and were feeling like the most well-equipped fishermen on the bay. Within a few minutes, all the young fishermen had rigged their rods for some bottom fishing, baited their hooks with a dead shrimp, and waited with anticipation as their legs collectively swung from their edge-of-the-pier seats. The talk was all about fishing, their adventures from the past, all about their new, old equipment, and dreams of today's catch. As they fished, they also kept their eyes on the boats leaving the marina for a day's fishing on the bay. They watched all the boats, and then one boat caught each boy's eyes, a shallow-water bay boat, with 3 fishermen busy getting ready for the day. One of the fishermen was working on at least 8 or 9 rods, all the latest and best that could be bought. He put them in special rod holders and moved 2 huge tackle boxes into place. The second fisherman was studying a set of charts and maps that surely showed the secret location of where the biggest fish were. The third fisherman was at the controls of the boat, carefully making sure that all the electronics were in good operating order. The boys stared in silence. They wanted to see into those big tackle boxes. They wanted to cast those rods. They wanted to learn about those electronics. They dreamed of going where those charts and maps said to go. What a wonderful daydream. They just knew that someday they'd be those 3 fishermen, and that was good enough for now. As the boat passed by, the fellow working with the tackle looked up and saw the boys on the pier. He quickly said something to his friends, and they too looked at the young fishermen. Both groups broke into big smiles. The fisherman driving the boat gave the boys a big thumbs up right back. There they sat, legs swinging, lines in the water, and thumbs up for good luck, all thinking about future adventures. But what they didn't know was that at that very moment, they were looking forward to the future, and the 3 fishermen in the boat were looking back to the past with just as much emotion and joy. Backlash. There may be only one thing that every person who's ever fished has in common. That one thing would be the backlash. You can't explain a backlash to a person who's never experienced one. A wise old fisherman told me there were only 2 types of fishermen, those who'd had a backlash and those who were going to have a backlash. My personal experience with a backlash is quite extensive. My first memory of a semi-debilitating backlash comes from an early fishing trip to the bay with my godfather, Ferd Anderson. Now, Ferdy was an old salt, or at least he looked old to me, and he, along with my dad, was responsible for my early love of fishing. Fishing was sacred to Ferdy, and I learned from him that fishing was much more than a mere hobby or a pastime. It took work and dedication and patience to be a good fisherman, and that going fishing was a privilege to be treated as such. At daybreak that summer morning, the air was cool and the water at Dow's Reef was green and clear, just like old Ferdy had special ordered it. With a live shrimp hooked to my line, I prepared to cast. I reared on back and let her fly. About halfway to its destination, everything stopped. Didn't have to look down to know what had happened. A backlash. I took a quick look at my reel, and there it was. A real bird's nest of a backlash. Turning my back to Ferdy, I tried to quickly pull the backlash free. But my efforts were futile. After my brief but agonizing struggle, Ferdy reached for my reel and said, "Let me take a look, partner." With an almost magical touch, Ferd tugged twice on the line, and it was free, and the backlash disappeared. You know, I sure didn't like having backlashes in front of Ferdy, but he made me feel like it was okay, just part of being a real fisherman. Another backlash I'll never forget was one that occurred on my family's fishing pier in the bay. I was about 13, and I was fishing with Susan Murray, the real pretty girl from right down the way. She loved to fish, and I thought this would be a good time to show off my prowess with a rod and reel. Well, things were going pretty well. I was out casting her a good 5 yards on every throw, and she sure was impressed. I decided to really let one go. You know what happened? The mother of all backlashes. I was quick to blame it on the wind, the line, my reel, and the fact that I didn't have on my best fishing shirt. Susan wasn't buying any of it. She sat silently and continued to fish. Oh, we continued to fish together over the next few years, but she knew, and I knew, that it just wasn't the same after the backlash. Many more backlashes have stayed in my memory, like the one that occurred just as everyone else in the boat was hooked up to speckled trout, or the one that was so bad you had to cut the line off your reel, thus ending your fishing for that day. I'll share just one more backlash story with you. I was fishing at a popular port for the very first time. A good friend had gotten the area's best guide to take us fishing as a special favor. This guide was not taking any new customers as he was booked up for a year and a half in advance. Impressed with the reputation of this guide, I, of course, wanted to do my best as an experienced fisherman. Everything was going great. He sure knew where the fish were, and my friend and I were catching an ice chest full of specks and reds. Then it happened. One of the surefire ways to get a backlash is to hook something on your back cast and then try to complete your cast. Well, that's just what I did. On my back cast, I accidentally hooked something, in this case, someone, the guide. I attempted to complete my cast, and two things happened. First, my hook dug into the top of his head, and second, a very large backlash appeared on my reel. The guide let out a short but meaningful yell, and soon he was instructing my friend on how to remove the hook from his head. During this ordeal, he made a special point of asking me to sit on the other end of the boat. Surely he didn't think I'd do that again. I was walking through my local tackle shop last week and picked up a silver box that contained the latest bait casting reel in the market. And there it was on the side of the box. This reel is guaranteed not to backlash. Well, thinking for a moment, I decided this reel also should have a special tag printed on its box. Warning, this reel may cause the loss of some very special memories. "20 questions. One of the most trying experiences known to man is that of teaching your wife or your girlfriend to fish. Now, I'm not saying this is always the case, but my experience has been akin to the worst nightmare of my life. My first attempt was with a college girlfriend, Muffy, a simple worm fishing trip for perch in a stock tank just outside the city. The key word here, worm. Our relationship never recovered from our worm discussion. Our foray into worm fishing went something like this. Upon seeing the worms buried in the dirt in the coffee can, Muffy quietly said, "They sure do seem peaceful and comfortable nestled in the dirt." To which I ignorantly replied, "Well, we'll change that, won't we?" That statement was the beginning of a very long morning and a very short relationship. As I pulled a worm from the dirt in the can and it started wiggling, these questions were asked in rapid-fire order. Do you think the worms have parents or some kind of family unit? Do you think worms have names or can talk to each other? How long does a worm live? At this point, in a flippant tone, I gave the second, less than sensitive answer that morning. I don't know how long worms live in general, but I'd say this one's got about 30 seconds to make its peace. More questions came as Muffy saw me poised with the worm in one hand and a shiny new hook in the other. Do you think the worm feels any pain when you puncture its little thin skin with that sharp pointy thing? Following the same theme, the next question was, have you ever heard a worm scream or make any sounds like it was afraid? To which I replied, no, but once a worm did ask me to tell his wife and children that he loved them. Now you won't believe this. I looked at my fishing date expecting a laugh, but instead watched as her eyes filled with tears. As most worms do, this one wiggled frantically as it was lowered to the surface of the water. Then a two-part question. Do you think it can breathe underwater? Do you think it's afraid right now? Then came the one question after which there are no more questions. Muffy sighed heavily and leaned back as she asked, do you think worms believe in God? To which I gave my last unkind, sinister answer. I don't know. I've never seen any worms in church. Going fishing. It's summertime and the living is easy. Well, maybe not easy, but it was too hot to work outside in the yard and our water had been rationed because of the drought. So I figured with water levels dropping, all the fish would have to be more densely packed into the resulting smaller areas of the rivers, creeks, and streams, you see. As an opportunist and a dedicated fisherman, seemed like a good time to get the dirt dauber nests off my spinning rod, clean up the reel, sort through the old tackle box, and slide off to the lake to see if I could reduce the fish population just a little. The spinning rod, made of several exotic materials, some of which I can't pronounce, which guaranteed me long, accurate casts and surefire hook setting, had, alas, seen better days. A couple of years' exposure to saltwater, combined with 14 months of storage in the large oven I referred to as my barn, had rendered the rod almost useless. It worked for a few days as a stake for one of my tomato plants, and then one day the wind picked up to 15 knots and broke the carbon fiber polyunsaturated hyperattenuated fishing stick right in half. Well, I'll have better luck with a reel, I thought. That sucker was made for saltwater. All the bearing races sealed against the environment, and the finish was sold to me as bulletproof, I thought. Turns out that's not exactly how it worked. The little case I was sold to keep the reel in, made of felt, had attached itself to the bulletproof finish, and the 80 yards of invisible, ever-soft, non-fouling 10-pound monofilament line. Well, by the time I got through peeling and scraping off the remnants of the felt cover, the reel looked like I had dragged it behind my truck for a week. And the handle wouldn't turn. Therefore, the spindle wouldn't turn, and I couldn't adjust the drag. When I tried to unlock it to pull the line off, the little gizmo that does the unlocking sheared off in my hand. I broke out my jeweler's screwdrivers to take the reel apart and quickly broke one screw off, flush with the housing. Then destroyed the blade of the only screwdriver that was the right size for the task at hand. So much for the reel. With some trepidation, based in part on my success with the rod and reel, I turned to the tackle box. Now this, dear friends, is a tackle box. It'll sleep 6 in an emergency, is hermetically sealed against wind, water, and nuclear holocaust, and normally requires 2 stout people to carry it from place to place. And I always place it dead center in any boat, smaller than the QE2, or deal with the resulting list to port or starboard in the bitter comments from my fishing buddies. But it was loaded for fish. Saltwater fish, freshwater fish, brackish water fish, lard fish, small fish. The only things I didn't have tucked away inside were a flounder gig and a harpoon, which is strapped to the outside. To protect all these treasures, the 2 gigantic hasps had built-in locks, like on a suitcase. Now, I occasionally misplaced my garden rototiller and lost one of my children for 2 days. What do you think the chances were that I could find the tiny set of keys to the gigantic hasps? And if you guessed slim to none, you guessed right. I tried every little key in our not-so-small inventory of homeless keys. A few fit, but none unlocked the treasure trove. Figured it couldn't be much of a lock given the size of the keyhole, so I tried to pick it. No luck. Then tried to gently pry it open with a small screwdriver. No luck. Brought out the big guns. First a small nail-pulling pry bar. Nope. Then a larger crowbar. Not a chance. Finally, with a 5-foot pry bar and a 2-foot cheater, I broke the first one loose. I also broke loose part of the side of the tackle box. Well, The smell which came from that little hole told me all was not well inside the fishing capsule. Indescribable is the nearest word I can use to describe it. My wife had been following my lack of progress, but when the odor drifted her way, she exited stage left in a flash. Our dog, Fang, who's been known to lovingly sniff at 3-day-old roadkill and to roll gleefully in just about any nasty thing she can find, jumped up, ran to her bowl of dog chow, and pushed it away with her nose. I placed myself strategically upwind from the casket and quickly pried off the other lock and another little bit of the tackle box at the same time. Forcing open the lid, what I found wasn't pretty. Wish I could tell you the source of the smells, but I honestly can't. It was an amorphous mass consisting of stink bait, salmon eggs, a bag of shrimp, a container of fishing worms, and some mummified squid. I'm sure the old stringer knife and the fishing net made their contributions, but they were sorely outclassed in this contest. All my rust-proof hooks were rusted, along with the snap swivels, which now could neither snap nor swivel. The skirts of all my spinner baits all melted into the world's largest rubber hula skirt and were permanently affixed to the bottom of the many trays. The bait casting plugs were split and peeling, their rust-proof treble hooks quite rusty. All my plastic worms and lizards were putty. I tried to dump out the contents to see if I could salvage anything, but it wouldn't dump. The only thing usable was a small bag of split shot. If I'm nothing else, I'm determined. I was going fishing. I made a trip to the tackle store and bought a kit. A small spinning rod, a small reel, a 4-pound test line, and a small collection of small lures, all bubble-packed in a small container. Next morning, bright and early, I drove to the lake, and in only 5 hours of intense fishing in the reduced water level caused by the drought, was able to land 2 small red-eared sunfish. Oh, well, dove season's only a few months away. Maybe I'll take a look at my shotgun. Now that's the end of side 1, so you can fast forward or just sit tight. I'll be right back. For all you fishermen out there listening, here's a chance for you to be a part of my fishing tales. If you know a good fishing story or just some outdoor occurrence that's a little or a lot on the unusual side, please get in touch with me at the phone number or address in the case of these tapes. If I use any part of your story, I'll send you a special gift that I know you'll enjoy. Bass tournaments. Can you remember when bass fishing was a relaxing pastime that required an energy level somewhere between that required to take a nap and rubbing your dog's head? Well, no more. The insidious element of continuous competition has now threatened to overtake our lakes and rivers. There are women's tournaments, youth tournaments, men's tournaments. There are one-day tournaments and two-day tournaments. There are amateur tournaments, professional tournaments. Oh, the list goes on and on. Now, most of this intense bassin activity takes place in the southern part of our great country. Now, this has, in fact, created a certain Dixie ambiance that is prevalent throughout the bass fishing world. This southern influence is clearly evidenced in a recent survey taken in the states of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. This survey included 100 typical male citizens in the 4 states just mentioned. Here are the results. Number 1, 80% of the men surveyed knew the past 5 champions of the Bassmaster Clinic, while only 9% could tell you who won the last 2 presidential elections. Number 2, 62% agreed that their local Ranger bass boat dealer would make a good Secretary of the Navy, while the other 38% felt that being a secretary was woman's work. Number 3, 89% felt that the single most important activity on Sunday was bass fishing. The other 12% were ordained Baptist ministers. Well, that's not quite true, you see. 2 fellows from the first 89% were also ordained Baptist ministers. Number 4, 71% thought that the Scud missile was a new bait from the Bomber Lure Company. Number 5. In a rare display of national awareness, 94% of those surveyed said they would not let Bill Clinton check their trout line while they went bass fishing. Well, let's analyze some of the other elements that have evolved, due in large part from these bass tournaments. First, the bass boat. No change in outdoor equipment has ever come close to the evolution of the bass boat. The 12-foot flat-bottom green aluminum skiff has been replaced with a 20-foot fiberglass hydroplane with a 3-color glitter glow paint job that won't sink even if you cut it in 3 pieces. The seat cushions that also had to be used at the Friday night football game have been replaced by orthopedically correct telescoping chairs that swivel. The electronic Magnum trolling motor has replaced your younger cousin Eddie, who you had convinced the most fun was paddling. The coughing and sputtering of your 5-horsepower Evinrude has been replaced with the smooth hum of a 200-horsepower V6 Superhawk Yamaha tack engine. The digital depth finder with graphic printing capabilities and optional fax attachment has taken the place of the old cane pole used by my cousin Eddie when he was on a paddling break. And last, but certainly not least, is the replacement of the perfectly good bait can with a supercharged, aerating, chemically balanced live well, the latest model of which has been known to bring certain baits back from the dead. Well, there's a brief look at the changing world of bass fishing. You can call it outdated or old-fashioned, but I'll tell you one thing for darn sure. If I decide to cut my boat in 3 pieces, it darn sure better sink. Latest trend. One of the newest trends in the world of the outdoors is fly fishing. It's a gentleman's way of tricking the fish, and it's supposed to be a very natural way of doing things. Now, there are several inherent problems with this form, not the least of which is having to relearn the entire process of casting. It's not extremely difficult, but it seems that you spend at least half your learning period untangling stuff from other stuff. An open area about the size of a football field's just about right for fly fishing. Also important for most fishermen is breaking what I call the rodeo syndrome. You see, every small boy has had one of those short little bullwhips that his parents got him at the state fair and rodeo. Natural tendencies lead him to treat that fly rod just like that bullwhip. That's right, you guessed it. Those techniques just lead up to more untangling of more stuff. Another part of the fly fishing phenomena is certainly a more positive part of the sport. The new fly fisherman gets to buy all kinds of new and different gear. Sportsmen love their gear, and fly fishing opens a whole new world of equipment. There are 2 or 3 different rods with matching reels, floating lines, sinking lines, and too many types of leaders to mention. The number of baits is endless, and each comes with a biological story, both historic and futuristic. And all new clothes are needed. Special hats and fishing vests with small tools that hang from the vest, as well as new waders, plus boots. And for after the day's fishing, a navy sweater with a little fish on it is a must. Now, high tech also has creeped into the fly fishing world. Countless videos dissect every part of the sport. These videos are designed to enlighten and educate the fly fishermen. Well, when your new cast has been perfected and all of your new gear has been secured and all of the videos have been memorized, you are ready to go fishing. Disappointment will soon turn to victory, and you'll be standing there in some picturesque stream with a perch that extends a ½ inch from either side of your hands. Now, you are a fly fisherman. You can now move on to the next level of fly fishing activity. And that is to tell anyone who will listen unbelievably long stories about unbelievably short fish while wearing your navy sweater with a little fish on it. Uncle Jake. Throughout my youth, I was fortunate to have been exposed to each and every aspect of the wonderful world of the outdoors. At times, my appreciation for the work that went along with these experiences was less than great, but the positive memories rush to fill my mind as I look back to a time quickly gone. I think the experiences that bring on the widest range of emotions are the ones that force their way into your mind when there is a need for the telling of the story. So, here goes. My Uncle Jake was going to take me and my cousin Eddie on an overnight campout on the banks of the river. The plan was to get there early enough in the afternoon to stretch a couple of heavy-duty trot lines in just the right location to ensure a world record catfish or two. We could fish from the banks all night long, or at least that was the plan. Uncle Jake had an old flat-bottomed skiff that all three of us would occupy as we went to check the trot line. The 9 p.m. trot line run yielded 3 whopper blue cats, 5 to 7 pounds each. Eddie and I just knew this was going to be a night to remember. We all knew that right behind catfishing on Uncle Jake's list, he liked to have a good stiff drink or two. Well, by the 11 o'clock trot line run, Eddie and I were doing most of the work. Uncle Jake was somewhat limited by the condition that resulted from his second favorite hobby. 4 more catfish were added to the catch, and Uncle Jake continued to celebrate our success. One clear rule had been established earlier in the day, and that rule was that the boat would be used only when Uncle Jake was aboard. Well, the 1 a.m. trot line run brought Eddie and me face to face with a dilemma. Uncle Jake was in a bourbon-induced coma-like sleep that was not going to be interrupted. After deciding that we had handled the 11 p.m. run practically alone, we decided that the rule established earlier now was no longer in effect, so off we went. Well, there was no moon. Our only light was a small kerosene lantern whose light was shadowed by the darkness of an entire universe. About 30 feet offshore, the absence of Uncle Jake suddenly seemed very meaningful. Eddie seemed kind of young and useless, and the river took on the feeling of the China Sea. Well, just as things were seeming to get bad, they got worse. In the dimming light of a now flickering lantern, a very large and ominous water moccasin began to slide across the bottom of Uncle Jake's skiff. I screamed at Eddie, and we both found our way to the top of a large ice chest in the center of the boat. I quickly picked up the heavy wooden oar and began to swing wildly at a serpent that was now desperately seeking its own cover. A clean shot at its head brought my best swing. I know it was my best swing because the oar came down with such force that it crashed through the bottom of the boat, and the river was soon seeking its level inside the entire boat. Eddie and I got real quiet for what seemed like about a year and a half, but was probably closer to 10 seconds. As the boat and all of its contents disappeared around us, we just knew that we couldn't let that old river sweep us away. We could swim for shore in hopes that Uncle Jake had died in his sleep. But we knew that if Uncle Jake was not dead, he'd certainly kill us upon awakening. Well, we had all night to get prepared. Uncle Jake's snoring was a constant reminder that he was still alive. About sunup, Uncle Jake began to stir, and before he was really awake, Eddie and I began to blurt out the whole truth about the last 7 hours of our lives. We apologized some more, and then we cried some. To our total surprise, Uncle Jake never said a word about his boat. He held us close and told us it only mattered that we were safe. Thinking back on that night, it was only Eddie who had hoped that Uncle Jake had died in his sleep. Tailin what? Here's a quick little story about a subject I'll just bet you've never heard about. Here's the scene. Doug was positioned on the banks of a small pothole lake just south of town. He carefully worked his fly rod as he lay a cast along the shoreline of the lake. He jerked the bright yellow and green popper along the reeds that were growing along the water's edge. Doug, definitely sight casting, had just seen his quarry moments before in those reeds where his popper was working. Suddenly, the water exploded and Doug had a hookup. The end of Doug's line raced for the middle of the lake, and the fight was on. After a brief but courageous struggle, Doug was removing the hook from the mouth of his trophy. Once this was done, Doug eased his trophy into the ice chest. What? No catch and release? No, not this time. A quick look in the ice chest gave the answer. There, gathered in the corner of that cooler, were 4 nice bullfrogs. That's right. Doug was after those Tailin bullfrogs. Louisiana logic. You see, there were these two Cajun-type fellows from down below Thibodaux, Louisiana, who kept on hearing stories about the great fishing at one particular East Texas lake. And the fishing stories kept coming, and pretty soon they just couldn't take it anymore. They decided that the upcoming weekend would be their weekend for a 2-day trip to this can't-miss lake. Checking their gear, you could see they were serious about their fishing. Let's see. There were 4 cases of Dixie beer. This small amount indicated the serious fishing nature of their trip. There were 300 feet of gill net, just in case they weren't biting. And there was their 48-gallon igloo ice chest with a false bottom, just in case there were problems with the fish limits. You could tell these were sportsmen. They arrived Friday night because they had to stop for beer. But Saturday morning, they were up and at 'em. They rented a boat with a small motor, and before 8 a.m., they were motoring across the lake to a spot suggested by a guy selling fish fillets out of his trunk. He seemed just like their kind of guy, so they decided they'd try his recommended spot. Well, it turned out to be a pretty good location, but by 10, they were getting low on beer, and they knew how dangerous it could be to run out of beer on a strange lake, so they headed for the marina. Well, now, as luck would have it, they made it back with a couple of beers to spare, just proving that it pays to think ahead. They cleaned their fish quickly and joined the other sportsmen at the Marina Tavern. Now, because these two old boys really wanted to fit in with the crowd, they were forced to drink beer after beer after beer. Well, the next morning they found written proof that they had fit in real well. They found papers in their pockets indicating that they had joined a local militia group, and they were to wait for further orders. Well, Sunday found them back on the lake in an even better spot than the day before. This spot had been given to them by the militia general and was available only to members of the militia. They caught fish after fish after fish, and finally one of them said, "Be sure to mark this spot. We got to come back to this place again." All fished out and back at the dock, the fisherman asked his buddy, "Did you mark that spot like I told you to do?" "Well, sure I did," replied his buddy. "I put a big X right on the side of that boat while we was catching them fish." The first fisherman looked at him in amazement and said in disgust, "Well, you idiot, how do you know when we come back to this place again we get that same boat?" Just part of the tour. The Port Aransas area of the Texas Gulf Coast is a hotbed of activity, with something to do for every member of the family. One of the most unique activities is the boat tour for viewing the whooping cranes at certain times of the year. This is very popular since there are just a very few whooping cranes left alive. Now, I like birds about as well as the next fellow, but my real passion's fishing. This story begins with 3 of my buddies and me on a fishing excursion to the bays and inlets just outside Port Aransas. As the 4 of us sat in the local cafe before daylight, our strategies were developed. My buddy Larry and I wanted to drift fish some of the shallow reefs in search of a limit of speckled trout, while our 2 friends were dead set on wade fishing the shallow grass shorelines in pursuit of feeding redfish. Within 30 minutes, my boat was sliding to a stop so that Greg and Tim could begin their wade fishing adventure. Larry and I settled on a spot to meet Greg and Tim a couple of hours later, and we were off to deeper water. The reef drifting worked very well for Larry and me. In less than 2 hours, we had our limit of trout, and were off to meet the other guys. We were a few minutes early, so we anchored up and began to wade fish the area just around the boat, in hopes of taking a redfish or 2 while we were waiting. Well, as we fished and talked, we noticed a bird-watching tour boat that was heading our way. We continued to fish, and as the bird watchers approached, we noticed that the boat was filled to capacity with a group of older ladies who appeared to be on the more refined and cultured path of life. As they passed within 50 yards of us, we tipped our hats, and they seemed to nod their approval. All in all, they appeared to be having a grand old time. I kept my eyes on their boat as they passed and was glad they were having a good tour. Just at that moment, I caught a glimpse of some action on the beach about 250 yards past the bird-watching boat, which was now heading straight for the action on the beach. Well, within the next few seconds, I realized just what the action was. My buddies, Greg and Tim, they were running down the beach as fast as they could run. There was one other thing. They were both completely naked. That's right, totally naked. Each carried their fishing rod in one hand and a stringer of fish in the other hand. Now, other than that, they had nothing. No hats, no shirts, no pants, no shoes. By this time, the birdwatching group also was aware that their tour was about to make a very special sighting. Our buddies Pat and the tour boat were locked on a near-miss course, and sure enough, Greg and Tim ran by the tour boat at a distance of no more than 20 yards. They never looked at the birdwatchers, but the same cannot be said for the occupants of the now silent boat. Every eye on that boat was trained on Greg and Tim as they passed. Well, you can just imagine the sincere sadness and compassion that we felt for Greg and Tim. Not for the event that had just occurred, but for the next 25 to 30 years that we'd be telling this story. It seems that in an effort to cross over a narrow piece of land to reach a secluded bay, Greg and Tim had stepped into a nest of large ticks that quickly attached themselves to every part of them and their clothing. The only relief was to get naked, remove as many ticks as possible, and make for the boat. I think that was their whole story, but I'll be honest, I was laughing so hard I could have missed a remark or two. I asked Greg and Tim if they were through fishing. I got no answer, and we headed for the marina. To reach the dock now, we had to pass a lot of houses in the outdoor deck of a very popular restaurant. Greg and Tim sat very still with their eyes straight ahead. Each was wearing only a life jacket with a tackle box that was placed carefully on their laps. I never wanted this moment to end, but it did, and later that day we sat in a comfortable seafood restaurant reviewing the day's activities. Actually, it was just Larry and me doing the reviewing while Greg and Tim were very quiet. Well, you won't believe what happened next. The table for 8 right next to ours was taken by our lady friends from the birdwatching boat. As they were seated, I moved over to their table. I explained to them that the 2 gentlemen on the beach were members of a nude fishing club, you see, and that the 2 fellows were in search of some relief as they misplaced their sunblock. The ladies, with a short, controlled laugh, nodded their understanding. You know, those ladies were less than 10 feet from our table, and they never recognized Greg or Tim. Guess they never got a good look at their faces. Well, that's about it for now. Hope you enjoyed them, and I look forward to sharing some more of my tales with you again real soon. Just remember, it's much better to listen to them than it is to be a part of them. Hello, and welcome to Fishin' Tales. Fishin' Tales is a collection of stories about the adventures and misadventures of the outdoor sportsman. I hope that these tales make you smile, tug at your heart, or maybe just bring back a memory or two. So sit back and take a listen, and remember my motto: never let the truth stand in the way of a good story. By the book. As one who learned fishing mythology from the outdoor television shows such as those produced by Bill Dance, Orlando Wilson, Roland Martin, and others, I've been brainwashed to believe that bass won't bite anything except that which is presented to it in the prescribed manner. That is, Orlando would have a heart attack if he saw someone throwing a spinnerbait at a deep-holed bass in the middle of summer, while Roland would choke and gag if he got a notion that even a novice angler would chunk a jig and pig over a gravel point and drag it back in the springtime. I mean, there are some things that you just don't do. For instance, live bait is making a little headway on a comeback, particularly since Roland bought a marina in his native Florida that does a land-office business in live bait. Dropping a live worm or minnow for bass has no place in the fishing book of etiquette. Similarly, using any type of bobber or cork while fishing for the treasured largemouth bass, particularly with live bait, would cause fellow anglers at Lake Fork to retch over the side of the boat. Most of the time, I fish with others of my ilk who have learned bass fishing under the same teachers, and who also have several tackle boxes filled with various fish stickers needed to provide for every happenstance of weather, season, or water condition. Just like a surgeon wouldn't use a sponge where he needed a clamp, a proper bass fisherman wouldn't limit his tackle so that substitution between lures would ever become necessary. Enter my friend Mike Finnegan, a former upstate New Yorker who fishes the same way he does everything else, aimlessly and with as little effort as possible. Despite my best efforts to coax Finnegan into behaving like a proper bass fisherman, he insists. And I shouldn't say insist, because for him to insist would imply that he cares anything about fishing. Rather, he continues to use the same tactics that he used on the northern lakes. Usually his tackle box, which is a 1-pound coffee can, contains a rusting mixture of lead shot, old spoons, treble hooks, and plastic bobbers, all tangled together with varying lengths of discarded monofilament. These, along with a styrofoam container of red worms that he always picks up at the marina, he uses in various combinations for every situation, whether we drift over a submerged river channel or anchor over a hump. The same God who looks after babies, drunks, and the mentally challenged also, I believe, watches out for inept fishermen. Without fail, whenever Finnegan and I go fishing, he with his haphazard conglomeration of incorrect tackle, and me with several $1,000s of state-of-the-art fishing killers, we always catch about the same number of fish. I might also mention that catch and release has no place in his limited angler's dictionary. The first time he saw me catch a good bass, hold it up for admiration, and then drop it back in the water, he screamed like a banshee. "Slipped right out of your hand?" he questioned, not wanting to believe what he suspected. "No, I let it go," I answered snobbishly. "If we turn them back, we'll always have something to fish for. If we're not out here to catch fish with the intention of eating them, then why would we care if there are any fish left to catch?" Finnegan argued. Knowing Finnegan's mindset, I long ago decided against attempting to convince him of the sporting aspects of catch and release. Instead, I simply gave him a disdainful snort whenever he drops a bass into the fish box, which delights Finnegan to no end. To make matters intolerable, Finnegan usually catches the biggest fish of the trip. This one he casually drops into the live well with just a hint of a glance in my direction and with an ever so slight smirk on his face. So far, I've resisted the craving to kill him by telling myself that he only lives through my generosity. The closest we've ever come to Fizz City was during a springtime trip to Twin Buttes Reservoir, when Finnegan showed up at the ramp with a mysterious package wrapped up in a brown paper sack. It was late March, and the bass were undoubtedly in pre-spawn, which indicated a chugger thrown into the shallow banks and brought back on fast retrieve. Well, while I was sorting through my tackle and laying out an assortment of buzzbait, Finnegan sat quietly in the back of the boat, smiling and fingering his package. Although I tried my best to convince myself that I didn't care, I couldn't stand it anymore, and I asked him what was it. Well, immediately I was sorry, and he grinned widely while unwrapping his prize. He says, "I was cleaning out my storeroom the other day and found my old standby lure that I used on Lake Erie. This baby has brought in more northern pike than you can shake a stick at, and I figured it should do just as well or even better on bass because they're dumber than pike." With this caustic remark about bass, the steam began to vent from my collar. However, when his prize lure came into view, I began laughing so hard that all the insults were forgotten. The old red and white striped daredevil spoon was about a foot long and about as wide as a shovel blade. Unaffected by my snickering, Finnegan tied the huge spoon to his line and dumped it over the side where it made a splash like a sounding rhinoceros. In order to troll his contraption, I dropped the revolutions of the motor to near stall. Even then, the pull on his line and his rod bent nearly double. However, Finnegan settled himself into the rear seat and braced for the long haul. Well, it hadn't been 5 minutes until I heard him scream with excitement and turned to find him jumping around the boat with a snapped rod. That he had a good fish on was obvious, although I was sure it'd break off, the way Finnegan was horsing it in by pulling hand over hand on the line. But looking at the rod and tangled line, I didn't have any better ideas. With the same god of the inept looking over his shoulder, Finnegan pulled in his ridiculous lure with a 6-pound hybrid bass attached. Since that was the biggest fish he'd ever caught, all fishing was over for the day, and we set off on a braggart's tour of the beer joints. By our second stop, I'd memorized Finnegan's yarn and figured that he'd enjoyed as much glory as any one fish should derive. While he was trying to coax some mildly interested acquaintances into coming out to the truck to see the fish, I took it out of the live well and stuffed it into the sleeve of a rolled-up rain slicker. It was touch and go for a while, but he finally had to believe that someone had stolen his fish out of that live well, particularly with my sworn statement that I'd seen someone running away from the boat with something tucked under his arm. It was a dirty trick, and I felt kind of bad about it for a few days. But the thought of Finnegan discovering the truth after a week or so of warm weather was worth the guilt. Besides, it was less trouble and more fun than having to kill him. Willpower. This is a true story about the new breed of lady anglers and the determination of Bass Pro Cindy Capteron. Cindy's story is worth reliving. It was 1988 at Lake Fork, Texas. The morning was cold and rainy. Cindy knew it was going to be a bad day when the motor on her boat wouldn't turn over. As the other boats raced for the lake, Cindy and her partner sat dead in the water waiting for a jump start from the owner of the marina. Finally underway, Cindy chose a small creek that had some protected water, where she felt there wouldn't be any boat traffic. She was right, but the lack of boat traffic turned out to be good news and bad news. About 2 hours into the fishing, Cindy's trolling motor gave out, and she had to pull her boat along the bank by the limbs of the overhanging trees, while fishing at the same time. Through all this, Cindy managed to land 2 nice bass. Given the conditions of the day and the mechanical obstacles, Cindy was pleased. With an hour till weigh-in, Cindy decided to head for the marina. Uh-oh. You guessed it. The engine was dead again. Now, Cindy was running against the clock. She knew she had to get out of the creek and onto the main lake for help. Cindy had no choice, and without hesitation, jumped into the frigid water and began to swim her boat out of the creek. Finally, she reached the mouth of the creek, but there was no boat traffic. After swimming the boat for a few more minutes, Cindy was exhausted. In desperation, she asked her partner to try the motor one more time. Unbelievably, the motor started. Cindy told her partner to start the boat moving to keep the engine from dying. The combination of the boat's movement, Cindy's cold-soaked clothes, and her exhaustion kept Cindy from being able to climb back into the boat. Her partner tried to help, but it was useless. So, with one leg slung over the side of the boat and holding on for dear life, Cindy was headed to the marina. Well, her arrival at the dock made quite an impression on the onlookers. As Cindy's fish were weighed in, she was taken to the local hospital and treated for hypothermia. However, Cindy's willpower and strength of conviction paid off. The 2 fish won Cindy a top 10 finish in the tournament. You know, it really is good to see that women today are striving for the same level of insanity that men have already achieved. Fishin' dog. How many stories have you heard or told about the activities of a hunting dog? I venture to say there is as many hunting dog stories as there are other kinds of outdoors stories. Well, here's a new kind of dog story for you. This is an honest-to-goodness fishing dog story that I can personally vouch for. At a fishing camp south of Lafayette, I met a black lab named Flounder. He was very unusual, to say the least. I asked his owner, Paul Boudreau, how the dog got the name Flounder. Without hesitation, Paul replied that the name, Speck, and Red were just too common. It was right about then that I realized that asking questions just might be the best part of the whole trip. We had decided to load the boat that evening for our early next morning departure. Paul asked me if I'd like to see just how smart Flounder was, and I said sure. Paul then laid all of our fishing gear on the front yard, while Flounder and I waited down by the boat dock. When Paul had finished laying out all our rods, 2 tackle boxes, a loading net, and a large igloo cooler, he joined Flounder and me at the boat. He looked at me and said, "Are you ready?" I said, "You bet." With that, he told Flounder to fetch the green fishing box, and sure enough, old Flounder walked right by the brown tackle box, picked up the green one, and brought it to the boat. Paul then asked for the spinning rod. After Flounder had passed over the fly rod and the bait casting rod, he carefully picked up the spinning rod and brought it to Paul. Well, this continued till everything was in the boat. I was impressed. Flounder was tired, and Paul was proud. That night, we were entertained with more stories about Flounder, but we were assured the best was yet to come. Daylight the next morning found us skipping across the water with Flounder proudly standing strong in the bow of the boat like he was looking for just that right fishing spot. Soon, Paul brought the boat to a smooth stop, and we went over the side of the boat for some early morning wade fishing. The cool, clear water was just over our knees. As I slowly walked away from the boat, I looked in Paul's direction, and there was Flounder walking quietly by his side. Soon, Paul had hooked up with a real nice speckled trout, and old Flounder stood at attention as Paul worked that trout closer and closer. When the trout was about 10 feet from Paul, Paul looked at Flounder and said, "Fish on," in a loud voice. With that, Flounder lurched forward, and within a matter of seconds, his mouth had a secure grip on that 18-inch trout, and he was bringing that fish back to Paul. Flounder held that fish until Paul had it on the stringer, and then, on command, Flounder dropped that fish from his mouth. That was repeated all morning long, and I was truly amazed each time Flounder landed a fish. Well, we had a great morning, and after the fish were cleaned, we consumed a large lunch. I settled into a very comfortable chair in the den overlooking the bay. As Paul walked through the room, he said I was in Flounder's very favorite chair. Guess I should have known that, because as soon as I sat down, Flounder found a spot on the floor right next to me. In just a few minutes, Flounder got up, went to the door, and began to scratch and paw at the door. Well, wanting to let Flounder know that I, too, was very intelligent, I got up to let Flounder go outside. As I reached the door, I saw Flounder make a quick turn, and before I could turn around, he settled down into the chair I'd just vacated. As I pondered what had happened, I realized Flounder had learned a very common fish camp activity. Flounder was indeed carrying on a fish camp tradition. Flounder had learned to lie. Bed and bucket. You know, all the misadventures that can be had while fishing don't always include fish, a boat, a fishing pole, or even water. Just listen and I think you'll understand. Susan Henry and her family lived on a small farm east of town. On their farm was a real productive 5-acre lake full of perch, bass, and catfish. The Henry family loved to walk the lake banks as they fished away many a spring and summer evening. Susan was originally from Pittsburgh. She and her family hadn't done a lot of fishing, with real little to no experience at farm life. So the stage was set. Susan's brother Randy had come to visit, and he was having a real good time. That was until one evening when the Henry family took Randy fishing. You could see the lake from the front porch. That was good, because Randy wasn't real ready to go when the family left for the lake. Not long after the family got to the lake, Randy left the house and started his quarter-mile walk to the lake. About halfway there, Randy had to go through a gate. As he chained the gate closed, he saw a bucket on the ground. Now, sleeping in a strange bed during his visit had caused some aching in Randy's lower back, so he decided to take the bucket with him so he'd have something to sit down on at the lake. Randy hadn't gone but about 50 yards when he saw a real large bull starting to walk in his direction. Now, Randy knew less about bulls than he did about fishing, so he didn't pay much attention to the bull coming at him. Now, he did notice the bull seemed to be picking up speed as the distance between him and the bull got smaller. All of a sudden, somebody from the lake yelled, "Run, Randy, run!" The bull, now on a dead run, was less than 75 yards from Randy. Randy took off running and spotted a tree that looked like a good place to be. He could hear the whole family yelling something, but he was busy in his race for that tree. And as Randy reached the tree, he dropped the bucket he'd been carrying and climbed to a branch about 6 feet off the ground. The bull swirled and snorted below him. The big old fellow nosed and then kicked the bucket that Randy had dropped. In a short time, the bull wandered off, and Randy climbed down from the tree. The whole Henry family was having a real good laugh as they joined Randy at his tree. "What were you yelling at me?" Randy asked. In unison, they all said, "Drop the bucket, drop the bucket." See, Randy'd learned a real good lesson. Never take a bull's feed bucket on a fishing trip. Lights, camera, action. Part of every fisherman's total fishing experience has become the viewing of hundreds of television fishing shows that now come into our homes on a weekly basis. At last count, there were 6 different networks hosting these shows, with more to come soon, I'm sure. I am convinced that the fishing shows have become the internet for the bubbas of our great land. Now, before I go on, I want you to know that I'm one of those bubbas who boots up everything from sardine netting in South Africa to ice fishing for Mrs. Paul's cod fillets in the Arctic. Also, much like the internet and its devotees, the fishing shows have become interactive with their viewers. Well, I'm not sure interactive, but many of the bubbas do make fishing motions and noises attempting to copy these of the celebrity host. Also, in attempting virtual reality, the fishing shows will soon be introducing a scratch and sniff program guide. But let's not kid ourselves. We all know that the sole purpose of these is to sell stuff. On one 30-minute show I watched recently, these items were plugged: 2 fishing poles, 3 fishing reels, a trolling motor, a battery, an outboard motor, a boat, 11 different baits and lures, an insect repellent, a scent spray for all baits, a 37-function pair of pliers, a travel agency owned by the host, sunglasses, a fishing box, a back support belt, an ice chest, a fish cleaning knife, a line of clothing, 2 motels, a lodge, a divorce attorney, and an airline based in Argentina. Well, they barely had time to hook a couple of medium-sized bass that looked like they'd been caught so many times they were eligible for a Screen Actors Union card. That brings us to a new part of these shows that seems to need some help: the dialogue. Most of the dialogue is between the celebrity host and the fish, with an occasional comment to the unknown guest. The latest trend is for the guest to offer yet another commercial opportunity. Example: on a recent show, the host introduced the guest as the owner of a chain of fine furniture stores across Alabama and Mississippi. I fully expected an Easy Boy recliner to be mounted on the front of the boat. But back to the dialogue. If you do watch any of these shows, how many times have you heard these phrases? Chunky little bass. I'd know it. Looks like a little football. I think I got a little. Better fish on. He tore up that bait. I think he saw the boat. Go back and grow up. Or, I'd like to catch your mama. There's so many more, and you'll know 'em when you hear 'em. I'd like to hear some real dialogue. You know, like, I like to buy fishing stuff 'cause it really ticks off my wife. Or, fishing's a great escape from household duties. Or, the most important item on my fishing trips, the beer. I believe that the producers of these shows are running out of topics. Just listen to some of the upcoming show subjects. Which fish that you find washed up on the beach are edible? What's the best bait for crabbing, chicken necks or chicken backs? Come on as we join the Montana militia as they dynamite rainbow trout on the Snake River. Stay tuned. Side 1 is over, so fast forward or hold on. Side 2 is coming up. For all you fishermen out there listening, here's a chance for you to be a part of my fishing tales. If you know a good fishing story or just some outdoor occurrence that's a little or a lot on the unusual side, please get in touch with me at the phone number or address in the case of these tapes. If I use any part of your story, I'll send you a special gift that I know you'll enjoy. Blind luck. A Gulf Coast sport that you don't hear much about anymore is the art of floundering. Basically, floundering is the process in which the flounderer wades through the shallow waters very near the shore in hopes of spotting a resting flounder. Once the flounder's been spotted, the flounderer then attempts to stick a flounder gig, very much like a spear, through the flounder. Once this has occurred, the flounder can be lifted from the water and placed on a fish stringer or placed in an ice chest. Oh, by the way, this all occurs in the dark of night. Floundering is just like all other activities covering the outdoors. There are those individuals who are completely committed to the sport to the point of the ridiculous. Two such floundering devotees were Carl Johnson and Robert Perkins. These two old boys had been floundering around together since they were teenagers, both now finding themselves in their mid-40s. Nothing much had changed over their 30-some-odd years, except the normal advancements in equipment. Better lighting, more comfortable wading boots, sharper and lighter flounder gigs, and so on. But the act of floundering was basically the same as 30 years ago. That is, until one 3-day weekend last fall. Carl and Robert had settled in for 3 nights of floundering. Just so you'll know, Carl's and Robert's floundering activities had become very competitive in the number of flounder taken by each man. Because of this competition, Carl and Robert wouldn't flounder together, but would go their separate ways and agree to meet up at a certain place and time. Well, at the end of the first night, Carl and Robert met up at a sandy point near the marina to compare the evening's results. Carl had 5 nice flounder up to 3 pounds each, but Robert had 8 flounder, all in the 2 to 3 pound class. After claiming victory, Robert asked Carl to see if he could see anything different between their flounder. Well, Carl studied Robert's flounder for a few minutes and then exclaimed, "These flounder don't have any gig holes in them. How can that be?" Robert smiled, said he had a new secret weapon, and pulled from his pocket a real small bottle that contained some reddish-orange fluid. Carl, noticing the bottle had an eyedropper, asked, "What the heck is it?" Robert paused. "Well, I can't tell you that, but I'll tell you what it does. 1 drop of this stuff over a flounder, and it's instantly blinded. Then you just reach down and pick 'em up." Carl was in disbelief, but Robert's 8 nice flounder were hard to argue with. The next night, Carl made the case that the competition was no longer fair, and that Robert should share his magic fish catcher. After some begging on Carl's part, Robert gave Carl his own bottle of this unknown red-orange magic stuff. That night, when Carl spotted his first flounder, he made his first drop perfect, only to be left empty-handed as he reached down to grab the flounder. The result was exactly the same on the next 6 flounder that Carl attempted to blind. Finally, the evening over and back at the meeting place, a disgusted Carl waited for Robert. Soon, Robert came up happily whistling as he approached their meeting spot. Robert hollered, "How'd you do?" Carl replied, "I couldn't blind a single fish. Must have been doing something wrong." Robert responded, "Well, that's too bad. I did real well," opening his ice chest to show off 7 nice flounder. Not a gig hole among them. Carl was angry and didn't speak again. Later the next day, after they awoke and met for some lunch, Robert said, "Gee, Carl, I don't think it's fair for me to win the $20 bet we had on who gets the most fish. Tell you what, if you'll just pay this bill for me, we'll call it even." Robert handed Carl a yellow bill of sale reading, "Clark's Wholesale Seafood. Purchase 15 flounder from 2 to 3 pounds." Carl looked up as Robert was placing a few drops of his red-orange magic on his eggs. Robert, without looking up, said, "Carl, you want any Tabasco?" The good old days. All fishermen 50 or over have had a common experience. Remember your earliest encounter with an outboard motor? Remember the pull rope? Everybody has had bad pull rope experiences. Here are the ones I personally recall. Number 1, a tiny bit of motor oil on the handle made it real slippery. On your first pull, the handle slipped from your grip, sending your fist right into your face, resulting in a bloody nose. Number 2, your mighty pull fully extended the rope, which didn't retract. If you were young and totally unknowledgeable about the mechanics of the starter rope system, you spent the next 10 minutes trying to push the rope back into the hole it was hanging from. Number 3, you gave it your best pull, but whatever was supposed to engage, something else didn't, and you strained your wrist, your elbow, and your shoulder. Number 4, the rope would break and the piece you were holding snapped back, lashing one or both of your eyes. Wonder if that's what caused all those pirates to lose an eye. Number 5, the engine would backfire, causing the rope to be violently jerked back toward the motor. Of course, the puller lacked the reflexes and or the experience to let go of the rope, sending his hand into the engine cover real fast, resulting in injuries ranging from scraped knuckles to broken hands. Number 6, after many pulls, your helpful cousin smelled gasoline and maybe something burning. Without asking, he decided to prevent this explosion by loosening the motor and dropping it to the bottom of the bay. The injuries that you inflicted upon your cousin were much worse than what the explosion would have caused. Well, all those bad times are behind us now. All of today's engines have an elaborate high-tech ignition system and a state-of-the-art long-lasting battery. Just one problem. Anybody seen my keys? Swamp fun. If you ever get a chance to fish the freshwater swamps of Louisiana for trophy bass, jump at it. However, there is one additional potential feature of this type trip that I want you to avoid at all costs. It sounds adventurous and manly, and it's easy to be enticed into a midnight alligator hunt. Now, here's how it works. Sometime during the day, while you're testing your skills against the local bass population, one of the old boys at the camp takes a hook that's about a foot long and the diameter of a golf club and baits it with a whole dead chicken. This hook is then tied to a 100-year-old tree with about a 20-foot piece of cable off an electric winch. This procedure could serve as a subtle hint as to the action that lies ahead. Alligators, you see, feed at night, so the line won't be checked until midnight. From dinner till midnight, they show videos of past alligator hunts. Now, I'd like to say that I believe that hunt is a poor choice of words for this activity. I think alligator confrontation is certainly a more suitable description for this midnight adventure. After 3 hours of alligator videos, it was my experience that what became clear to me was that nothing was real clear. As the videos replayed in my mind, our small boat sputtered through the swamp darkness. The trees to which the alligator lines were tied were marked with reflectors so that we could find them easily. When the Q-beam light would catch a reflector, it looked like a single red-eyed monster staring at you from the swamp. We quickly located our best alligator tree, and as luck would have it, the cable was stretched straight out, indicating the presence of an alligator or a bass large enough to eat a whole chicken. We slowly approached the tree, and upon achieving our proper position, Ronnie, my alligator guide, grabbed the cable and turned to me and said, "Just remember, the alligator's just as scared of you as you are of him." I replied, if that was true, then this water would never be fit to drink. Ronnie slowly pulled on the cable. With our light shining brightly on the spot of black water where we thought the gator would surface, I waited as Ronnie pulled. Suddenly, the alligator surfaced, and surfaced some more. This gator was so big he looked like 3 sets of Wayne Newton's luggage. Well, the surface is apparently not where this creature wanted to be, because that's when the action started. The videos had not done justice to the sheer power and violence these gators can create when they realize the situation. The idea at this point was to shoot the gator in the head with Ronnie's .357 Magnum pistol. The gator seemed to sense this plan and evidenced more fight in him than Ronnie had anticipated. Finally, the gator paused just briefly, and Ronnie put 2 quick bullets between his eyes. Without a splash, the gator sank, and the swamp returned to a peaceful state. Well, I wanted to leave immediately, which did not arouse the slightest response from Ronnie. With characteristic single-mindedness, he said, "Now all we have to do is tie the gator to the side of the boat and return to camp." He did add, however, that this old boy was so large that it'd be quite a trick to tie him on without turning our small boat over. And Ronnie continued, "The problem with that is, by now, our boat most probably is surrounded by curious gators looking for an easy meal." I was starting to really not like Ronnie. After an hour of tying up the gator and riding slowly back to camp, my nerves began to return to near normal. Our prize was exalted by the other camp members, and my personal night of terror was now recounted as an expedition of action and individual bravery. But I will tell you that whatever you paid for that alligator belt or wallet, it was too cheap. Fishing box. The fishing box, or tackle box, is a window to the soul of its owner. The contents of that box, if interpreted correctly, can tell you all you want to know about the owner and maybe even more than you wanted to know. Let's take a look. A 3-year-old Hershey bar clearly indicates a man who has turned away from junk food and cares about his body. Oh, here's a photo of his mother-in-law with a head cut off, which is evidence of his attempt to carefully prepare a photo locket for his wife, but which he must have forgotten to give her. And there's a can of beer, obviously for hair care, since he promised his wife that he wouldn't drink while he was on the boat. And here's a Frank Sinatra tape hidden in the bottom of the box. Must be another surprise gift yet for his wife, because it's exactly the same tape that she lost, the one that she loved to play on Saturday morning when the TV fishing shows were on. And stuffed in the corner of the box, hidden from view, the beautiful Christmas tie that he thought he had lost. Well, let's look back and see what we've learned about this man. First, he cares about his health and about taking care of his body. He understands the importance of having a good relationship with his wife's family. He cares about his appearance and looking good to his wife. And finally, he loves to see the surprise and appreciation on her face as he gives her surprise gifts. I guess you'd have to say, though, that he isn't perfect. His absent-mindedness did cause him to lose that beautiful Christmas tie. What a night. Some experiences in the great outdoors are absolutely, positively unforgettable. Having first-hand experience with this one, I can tell you I don't think terminal amnesia could erase the following events from my head. It's late August. I was a 15-year-old sportsman with much more confidence than knowledge. All through my youth, I was real lucky to have a family home on the bay. There I spent day after day, hour upon hour, honing my skills as a saltwater angler. At the same time, I was developing an appreciation and love for coastal fishing that still runs deep 35 years later. But back to the story. I enjoyed everything the bay offered: shrimping, crab traps, all kinds of fishing, and setting a trot line along the shallow waters of the shoreline searching for redfish. One way to increase your trot lining success was to camp out on a lonely stretch and run your line all night long. If everything was right and you could make it all night, you'd almost be sure of a nice mess of redfish the next morning. On this particular calm August afternoon, me and my cousin Bub, who was more like a brother to me, decided conditions were right for an all-night trot lining event. So we started preparing to load my 12-foot aluminum boat with an 18-horsepower motor for our excursion. We had a 50-hook trot line that stretched close to 300 feet. We had 15 or so poles to hang the trot line on, and we had a cast net and bait bucket so we could catch our bait when we got there. We took a lightweight tarpaulin to build a lean-to on the beach. We took 2 ice chests, one for fish and one loaded with food and something to drink for the long night. Finally, we were ready to go about 3. By 4, we'd found our camp spot on Mosquito Point, and we were preparing to hang our trot line. By 7:30, all 50 hooks were baited with live or cut mullet, and we were raiding the ice chest for food. As we burned a few hot dogs over a beach fire, we saw a big thunderhead back to the northwest, but really didn't pay much attention to its movement. By 10:30, we'd taken 3 nice redfish and were eating again. We checked the trot line again about midnight, taking 1 more 22-inch redfish. We wanted to get some sleep, so we set our travel alarm for 2:30 and laid down on beach towels under millions of stars. However, a few minutes before the alarm sounded, a crack of lightning was so loud that me and Bub yelled out loud as we sat straight up and felt the first few raindrops hit our faces. The stars were gone and the wind was starting to blow real good. We really quick realized that this was the thunderhead we'd seen earlier, and we knew it'd blow through soon. We were half right. The thunder rolled, the lightning flashed, the rain fell, and the wind blew real hard. It got worse and worse. By 3 a.m., Bub and me were scared and ready to go. The bay was so rough, we knew we couldn't make it back to the house. But there was a little marina about a mile from us where Mosquito Point stopped. We could walk the boat close to shore and make it to the marina and get out of the storm. We loaded the boat and started walking into what had to be a 30-mile-an-hour wind and a driving rain, where every drop stung your body like a misplaced shot from a BB gun. After what seemed like hours of walking, I felt like we must have got turned around and were lost now. I knew, with how far we'd walked, that the marina light should have been real visible, but there was no light to break the hold of the darkness. Bub agreed we must be lost, so we pulled the boat up into the grassy shoreline since there was no beach. We climbed into the boat and pulled the tarpaulin up over our heads and hunkered down for what was left of the night. The rain and wind seemed to signal the end of the world, and me and Bub thought we'd run our last trot line. We must have dozed off, 'cause the next thing I knew, something or somebody was shaking our boat and asking if anybody was under the tarp. We threw back our death shroud, and there, in the still of a very gray morning, stood the owner of the marina we'd been searching for. It seemed that during the storm, the marina had lost all power and had no lights. That made sense to old Bub and me, since the marina dock and its motel and restaurant were less than 100 yards from our rain-filled boat. Fishing Tales. One of the best things about the sport of fishing is the endless stories of amazing things that have happened over the history of fishing. I'd like to share just a few of these stories with you. What would you say if somebody asked you if a rod and reel casting champion could cast a golf ball farther than a pro golfer could hit one? Well, here's your answer, provided by angler Steve Radjeff and PGA pro Fred Couples. Couples was the first to go. With his trusty driver in hand, he let go with a wallop that sent that golf ball 333 yards downrange. That's well over the length of 3 football fields. Next up, the fisherman. Radjeff had won several casting championships for both distance and accuracy. For today's test, Radjeff was using a 12-foot two-handed surf rod with a revolving spool reel. A golf ball, which weighs just less than 2 ounces, was attached to his line. After swinging the rod in a circular motion above his head, Radjeff let it fly. That ball came to rest at an unbelievable distance of 337 yards. The fisherman had won, but only by 4 yards. Now here's a story about an angler who was forced to use his fishing gear to help deliver his own baby. It was after midnight when our angler's wife went into labor. As he was trying to call the doctor, his wife yelled from the bathroom that it was too late. He hurried to her side just in time to help in the birth of their son. Suddenly, he realized there were things that needed to be done. He raced to the den and returned with his fishing tackle box. He quickly used his fishing knife to cut the umbilical cord. Next, he took his hook remover tool with a small but strong clamp on the end of it and clamped off the cord. The doctor arrived shortly, and when he needed additional help, the angler provided his newest fishing hat that conveniently had a light on the front of it. It worked perfectly, according to the doctor. How's this for an amazing fish story? Angler David Romero caught an unbelievable 3,001 largemouth bass in just 73 days. He released all but 24 of the fish. His best day was 99 bass. Over the course of the 73-day period, he caught one fish that had a deformed fin and tail. Now, that's not unusual, but what was unusual was that he caught that fish 6 times. Dick Jeffries was a devoted surf fisherman who, one August day in the surf, had a very unusual thing happen. He was fishing a double hook rig with each hook baited with a live finger mullet. On this particular cast, just as the baits reached the surface of the water, a large seagull swooped down and grabbed one of those wiggling mullet. In that same instance, a nice speckled trout grabbed the other mullet, and the fight was on. Both were well hooked, and at different periods each appeared to be winning the battle. 2 or 3 times the seagull lifted the trout clear out of the water, and twice the trout pulled the seagull under the blue-green surface of the waves. Now Dick finally landed this unusual duo, but soon the seagull was unhooked and set free. But the trout, well, he wasn't quite so lucky. Well, that's about it for now. Hope you enjoyed them, and I look forward to sharing some more of my tales with you again real soon. Just remember, it's much better to listen to them than it is to be a part of them.